Italy, the country, is often associated with art, beauty, and culture. Its legal history tells a more complicated story. Until 1981, Italian law still reflected centuries old ideas about honor, family, and women's bodies. In the 1960s, long before those laws were questioned, a case from rural Sicily forced the country to confront what justice actually looks like. This is the story of Franca Viola. Hi, welcome to Collectively Vigilant. I'm Dr. D. This is the first episode of 2026. So let me start out by wishing all of you a very happy new year. This month also marks our first year Collectively Vigilant, the podcast's anniversary. The YouTube channel has been around for almost a year and a half. So thank you so much for listening and watching these videos. Thank you for your comments. Thank you so much for sharing this show. It truly makes a huge difference. With that being said, let's begin with the story, the remarkable life of Franca Viola. Franca Viola was born on January 9, 1948 in Alcamo, Sicily in southern Italy. She was the first-born daughter of Bernardo Viola and Vita Viola, both poor farmers, and she had a little brother, Mariano Viola, who was 9 years her junior. The family had ancient roots in the south of Italy, a region that basically bullies the rest of the world with its exceptional cuisine and with its breathtaking landscapes. This gives Italians a very strong pride in their cuisine and cultural identities. It's no wonder then that the south of Italy is known for its strong family bonds and resilience despite a lot of poverty. And this culture of silence is best showcased in the Godfather trilogy. And not only that, tied to this really strong cultural identity is an even stronger culture of chastity of women. And in this landscape, our story is set. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Italy was still a very poor country, and by the time Franca was in her teens, she was basically finishing school, her only wish in life was to continue her education and find someone who would love and cherish her. While she was nursing this dream, all the eligible bachelors of Franca's town were dreaming of marrying her. She was renowned for her beauty. In the same town, born to a very different family, was a young man by the name of Filippo Maladia, who had his heart set on marrying Franca Viola. Unlike Franca Viola, who comes from a very poor family, Filippo Maladia was born into a wealthy family. He was the nephew of the undisputed boss of Casa Nostra, the Sicilian mafia. This meant that he enjoyed all the privileges that such an association offered. While most of the Sicilians were actually struggling to make ends meet, Filippo Maladia drove around town in his Alfa Romeo Giulietta and spent money freely buying alcohol. This town of Alcamo was a stronghold of the Sicilian mafia, so Filippo Maladia's position and future was all set to become a mafioso. He walked around town with the calm assurance that his money, his good looks, and his status was set. This meant that Filippo Maladia was one of the most eligible bachelors in town, yet he only had eyes for Franca Viola. The pair had exchanged glances and greetings around town. Franca had formed the belief that there was a decent man hidden behind Filippo's flashy exterior, and she told her parents that she would be open to a courtship with Filippo. Bernardo, the father, was well aware of Filippo Maladia's reputation. He had heard the many stories of Filippo terrorizing the neighborhoods. After drinking alcohol, he used to speed through narrow streets in his car, and he flashed around a 9mm pistol. Bernardo was well aware that the local police constantly had an eye on Filippo. As a hardworking man, an honest man, and humble man, Bernardo Viola had little respect for the young mafioso Filippo. A few days after Franca told her parents about her growing feelings for Filippo Maladia, Filippo arrived at the Viola house to introduce himself to her family and to begin the courtship process. Once inside the family home, Filippo announced his intentions to be engaged to Franca Viola. Bernardo, though a poor farmer himself, was not easily intimidated. He wanted his daughter to marry a man who would take very good care of her. Filippo smugly retorted that there was no better man in town than himself. Bernardo initially implied that he would prefer Franca to be married to a man who worked for a living. Filippo was insulted by this remark but remained quiet. Eventually, Bernardo basically broke his silence and he explicitly said that he wanted Franca to be married to a man who would work for a living. But Franca herself had expressed interest in marrying Filippo, so Bernardo was willing to consider this engagement, but on one condition, that they would get to know each other first. Filippo was not the type to take orders from someone he considered to be a peasant, and he would not have tolerated such disrespect had it not been for Franca Viola. He was willing to do as he was being told. In the next few weeks, Filippo and Franca met under the watchful eye of Franca's mom and the company of her little brother. But as Franca truly got to know Filippo better, she realized something that her father knew intuitively. Filippo was not the man for her. He was boastful, he was brash, he was a brainless man who was full of bravado, and he had absolutely no substance. Franca made her wishes known to her family. So the next time Filippo came around, Bernardo the father told Filippo that he had failed in his test. Without Bernardo's approval, Franca and Filippo's marriage could not go ahead. For the whole of 1964, the Viola family did not hear a word from Filippo Maladia. After being rejected by Franca and her whole family, Filippo actually left Sicily and spent a whole year in Germany just to save face. By early 1965, the atmosphere of this town had completely changed. Many high-ranking mafiosos, including Filippo's uncle, had actually been arrested. The Casta Nostra no longer had the same stronghold over town, and those who did remain in town were very afraid of the new police commissioner, Lorenzo Camilleri. Upon his return to Alcamo, Filippo was keen to pick up where he had left off. He wanted what he thought was truly owed to him, his mafioso lifestyle and Franca Viola. His desire for her had only intensified during his absence. In early 1965, and this was in the month of May, Filippo spotted Bernardo Viola in town and approached him. In a callback to an earlier conversation, Filippo Maladia told Bernardo that he had actually been working the entire time he was living in Germany. He was hoping that this would impress Bernardo. However, Bernardo remained completely unimpressed and simply conveyed his daughter's wishes. He said, quote, "Franca has not missed you. She can find a better husband than you," unquote. Shortly after this exchange began a campaign of intimidation against the whole Viola family. A few weeks later, on Friday, May 28th, Bernardo arrived at his farm and discovered that his warehouse, where he kept all his farming tools, was on fire. After discovering several petrol cans around the building, Bernardo headed into town to report the arson to the police. On his way, he crossed paths with Filippo Maladia. The young man smiled at Bernardo smugly. Later that evening, Bernardo was given the message. The fire was just a warning. 2 months later, 500 grapevines were prematurely cut and destroyed on the Viola farm. This was a devastating financial blow to the family whose entire income was based on their farming. They would just have to make do with all the remaining crops. However, by October, even those crops had been completely destroyed. This time, not by a fire, Bernardo arrived one morning and found lots of sheep and cattle grazing on his field. There was nothing left for the family. The destruction of the warehouse, the tools, and the crops meant that the Violas would have absolutely no money for the coming year. When the winter arrived, they were forced to turn to public charity for food. While the Violas maintained a cheerful public facade, privately, all of them were humiliated. The following day, Filippo Maladia and 2 of his friends arrived at the Bernardo farm. Filippo Maladia informed Bernardo that he must let go of his farm completely within 3 days. He then lifted his shirt to reveal a 9mm pistol which was tucked into his waistband. There was no question that Filippo was responsible for the damage of the entire Viola farm, but without any proof, there was nothing that the police could do. Meanwhile, Franca Viola was so terrified of Filippo that she barely left her house at all. On Christmas Day, Filippo Maladia gathered his crew and stalked the Viola family as they attended the Mass on Christmas. The next day, bright and early at 7 a.m. on December 26th of 1965, a gang of goons reached the street where the family lived. They fired gunshots into the air as a warning so that no resident would come out, and this was a warning basically that everyone should mind their own business. Then 12 masked men, these were armed men, they came out of cars and forced their way into the Viola family's home. Vita Viola, Franca's mom, screamed at her daughter to run, knowing what these men would do next. Vita tried to hold off these men on the ground floor while Franca Viola ran upstairs. But she was chased downstairs by 4 men who dragged her down out of the front door. Franca's little brother, the 8-year-old Mariano, actually clung to his sister all the way, and he clung to her to such an extent that these 12 masked men was forced not only to kidnap Franca, but actually they kidnapped Mariano as well. And they were quickly whisked away in waiting cars. Bernardo Viola returned home as quickly as he heard what had happened, and then he reported the kidnapping to the police commissioner Lorenzo Camilleri. Vita Viola knew for certain who had kidnapped her children. Although all of these men were wearing masks, Vita had actually locked eyes with Filippo Maladia as he was dragging Franca and Mariano out of the front door. Despite knowing who was responsible, Bernardo and Vita were at a complete loss. Wary of Filippo Maladia's mafia connections, no neighbor offered any assistance or information. Fortunately for the Violas though, the new commissioner, Lorenzo Camilleri, wasn't one to just sit around and wait. He immediately began searching for Franca. Filippo Maladia had sped away from the town of Alcamo into the countryside. Behind him, Franca and Mariano were seated on the back seat and they clung tightly to each other. Filippo told Franca that after he was done with her, she would not be able to marry any other man. But in complete defiance, she shouted at him and told him that she did not love him. Filippo laughed and retorted, "Who cares?" The car then stopped eventually at a remote farmhouse, and 8-year-old Mariano was basically beaten and pried away from his sister, and he was driven back into town. He was later found abandoned on the streets on the outskirts of town. Franca was dragged into the farmhouse. She screamed, but nobody would hear her. For the next 6 days, she was starved, she was taunted, she was insulted by Filippo Maladia. By the 7th day, Franca was so weak that she lay on the floor semi-conscious, barely able to move. Filippo then violated her for the first time. He knew that under any circumstance, when an unmarried Sicilian girl or a young woman loses her virginity, even in the case of a sexual assault, she would become a shamed woman. The dishonor on herself and her family would then only be repaired through the ancient practice of matrimonial repertoire. This was a legal and social practice in Italy, formally recognized by law in Article 554 of the 1930 Penal Code, under which a man who had kidnapped and sexually assaulted a woman could erase his entire crime just by marrying her. The logic was that the harm was not considered an act of violence against the woman or a person, but as a loss of family's honor. And this would damage our family's social standing. Marriage was supposed to be the only way to repair this woman's honor, her family's honor, and this would completely extinguish the criminal liability of the kidnapper, even if the woman was a minor. This was also connected to another ancient concept of feuatina, a traditional Sicilian elopement originally meant as a consensual way by which a couple whose families were opposed to their relationship would run away. Over time, especially in the 20th century, this has often been abused as a coercive and violent tactic where women were abducted and sexually assaulted so that their marriage could be socially and legally sanctioned. In cases like Franca Viola's, Fiotina had become a weapon, not a romance. This was supposed to trigger expectations of a repertory marriage. Filippo Maladia knew the law, and he knew that the law was on his side. This law applied even when victim was a minor, and Franca was actually 2 months shy of her 18th birthday. At the beginning of January, Filippo Maladia relocated Franca Viola from his farmhouse to his sister's house in Alcamo. By this stage, the Maladia family had been in contact with the Viola family and negotiations were underway. Knowing full well what he was up to with Franca Viola, the two families were nearing an arrangement and a wedding date. On Thursday, January 6th of 1966, 12 days after Franca Viola was kidnapped, Commissioner Lorenzo Camilleri and his officers surrounded Filippo Maladia's sister's house. They demanded that Filippo release Franca immediately. There was a commotion, and then suddenly two figures appeared on the second floor balcony. Filippo held up a visibly weak Franca Viola in front of all the police officers. As the officers leveled their gun at Filippo Maladia, Franca shouted, "Don't shoot." The police lowered their weapons, and then Filippo agreed to surrender Franca and himself. As she walked out, she collapsed into the arms of her father. Filippo offered absolutely no resistance when Filippo was being held by Commissioner Camilleri. He was placed immediately under arrest. As he was being placed under arrest, he was smiling and he asked for a cigarette. Filippo then looked at Franca in an air of anticipation. He believed that she would insist that Filippo be released because she would basically agree that by this time Filippo was her husband, as the centuries of tradition had demanded, as this was the only way in which she could remedy the disgrace she had brought upon herself and her entire family. Franca paused in front of Filippo Maladia, looked at him in the eyes and told him, quote, "I will never marry you. Goodbye," unquote. Filippo's smile completely vanished and the police took him away. Reunited with her family and safely back at home, Franca came to know that her parents had agreed to marry Franca to Filippo during her time in captivity. But Bernardo quickly reassured his daughter that the marriage negotiation was just a scam, just in order to get Commissioner Camilleri to discover where she was being held, and there was no marriage that was planned. In the meanwhile, Vita, the mother, was very worried about her daughter's future, but Franca was very confident in her decision. She insisted that she would rather remain unmarried her entire life than be married to a man like Filippo Maladia. In standing her ground, Franca Viola had become the first Sicilian woman to ever refuse a matrimonial repertoire with her violator. The price of Franca's resolve was very high, especially for poor people like the Violas. But as a family, they persevered. In the months leading up to Filippo Maladia's trial, life for the Viola family was extremely grim. The earlier destruction of their farm meant they had absolutely no money and very little food. Bernardo was desperate to find work, but nobody in the town and the surrounding villages would hire Bernardo as a farmhand. Franca became completely reclusive. She shut herself inside her home just to avoid the hostilities and judgment of the public around her. The Violas were guarded around the clock by the police to ensure that Filippo Maladia's family or friends wouldn't follow them and wouldn't follow through with the death threats. Many of the townspeople really admired Franca's courage, but they still considered her decision to be extremely ill-advised. During a council meeting of the town, it was proposed that the entire council should stand in solidarity with Franca Viola. The proposition was unanimously approved, but when one of the councillors stood up and rhetorically asked all the men in town if they would be willing to marry a dishonored woman, not a single hand moved. By December 1966, Franca Viola and her parents arrived at the courthouse under armed police escort. Of the spectators who packed the courtroom, a vast majority were family and supporters of Filippo Maladia and his 11 accomplices. The room was palpably hostile, but press from all over Italy was standing outside the courtroom. The northern part of Italy, which was culturally more progressive, had come to this small southern countryside town to witness history in the making. The Viola family endured the crowd's insults, their death threats. Even their lawyer was met with extreme jeers. The Violas sat behind the public prosecutor and their own lawyer. On the other side of the room were the lawyers representing the accused, all 12 of them, including Filippo Maladia. Under oath, Filippo Maladia stood up and told the court that he and Franca Viola were in love with each other and that her parents were against them. Bernardo, the father, had called off the engagement against Franca's wishes. Filippo then said that he and Franca had arranged for the elopement together in order to force her father's hand. He claimed that they had been consensually intimate many times during their escape, and this was nothing new for Franca because she had already been intimate with Filippo many times 2 years ago during their initial courtship. He elaborated this by saying that there were many times when Franca's mom, who was supposed to be overseeing them, would leave and they were left unsupervised. To prove Filippo's assertions, Filippo's defense attorney requested that a medical expert be granted permission to physically examine Franca Viola's hymen in order to prove that she had lost her virginity many months ago, not during the elopement. The prosecution vigorously objected to this request and it was thankfully denied by the court. Filippo then also claimed that he and Franca had planned this entire staged kidnapping the day prior on Christmas Day. The fiotina was an agreed upon arrangement between himself and Franca, and no actual kidnapping or sexual assault had taken place because she was in on it. Filippo Maladia concluded his statement by saying that Franca's true wish was to marry Filippo, but her tyrannical father would not allow it. The defense then also brought many people who lied on Filippo's behalf. In support of Filippo's claim that he and Franca were completely in love and fiotina had been pre-planned, the defense even brought on a woman by the name of Anna Lungaro. Anna lived right next door to Filippo's sister and she had witnessed the standoff between the police and Filippo. Anna, in fact, testified in court that she had heard Franca shout, "Don't shoot, he is my husband," in order to protect Filippo from the bullets that were being hurled at him, in order to protect the man she loved from the police officers' bullets. As the defense finished presenting their case, none of the 12 accused seemed to be worried about their future at all. They talked amongst each other, they were joking, they were even smoking cigarettes inside the court. The prosecution's argument was very simple. In a clear violation of the law, the 12 defendants had kidnapped Franca Viola and then Filippo Maladia had sexually assaulted her several times. The prosecution conceded that there is such a thing as Section 554 of the Criminal Code, and these actions would cease to be crimes in relation to Franca Viola. However, given Franca's continued refusal to do so, which was her right, the fact of the crimes remained, whether the fear of physical reprisal or simply some sort of social stigma. No one in the community was willing to testify on the Viola family's behalf. The prosecution's case was limited to what those within the family claimed took place. Both Vita and Bernardo testified separately to the events leading up to their daughter's abduction. They confirmed that back in the year 1963, Franca was indeed engaged to Filippo Maladia, albeit conditionally, on the two becoming acquainted with each other. After spending time with Filippo, Franca had realized that she would not be able to marry him, and so the proposal was rejected. Franca's parents testified to the campaign of intimidation and destruction that followed that refusal. Despite the defense's attempt to prove otherwise, Vita remained steadfast and said that she could recognize all 12 men who were in the courtroom. even though she agreed that they were wearing masks. Even then, she could recognize all of them. Vita was able to recognize Franco by his eyes, and she could do the same with others as well. Franca's aunt and grandmother also testified that Franca's parents and her little brother Mariano all enjoyed Christmas Day together, and at no time did Franca have any interaction with Filippo as the defense was claiming. Finally, Franca Viola herself sat in the witness box. She described her ordeal at the hands of Filippo Maladia in very clear and precise detail. She denied any fiotina had been pre-planned. She maintained that none of this was consensual, and Franca firmly stated that she was not now, nor she ever was, in love with Filippo Maladia. Franca was pressed as to why she would now go against all the tradition by refusing to marry Filippo Maladia and restore her family's honor. To which she replied, quote, "I am not the property of anyone. Honor is lost by those who do certain things, not by those who suffer them." Unquote. After providing her testimony, Franca stayed away from the courthouse for the remainder of the entire trial. She could no longer face the endless intrusion of reporters and photographers, and nor could she hear any more of the bad things that Filippo Maladia's supporters were hurling at her as she would go in and out of the courtroom. Instead, she relied on her family's reports. Despite continued threats to the Viola families, Bernardo never missed a single day of the trial. In their closing statement, the prosecution requested exemplary sentences for each of the defendants to illustrate to everyone that violence should never be rewarded. This suggested that Filippo Maladia's accomplices receive ranging from 4 months to 13 years, proportional to their respective roles in the kidnapping of Franca Viola. For Filippo Maladia himself, the prosecution wanted a 22-year sentence. The defense continued to argue, though, that no crime had been committed and Franca was in on the entire plot. The defense also stated that it was unfair for Filippo Maladia to pay dearly for his action, committed in accordance to a social custom which was actually sanctioned by the law. On the 7th and final day of the trial, the preceding judges retired to deliberate this case. To the local community and to Sicily as a whole, the trial marked a potential turning point in the social history of all of Sicily. At 5:30 in the evening, the judges delivered their verdict. The courtroom found resoundingly in favor of Franca Viola and her family and sentenced Filippo Maladia to 11 years in prison for sexual assault and kidnap. 8 out of the other 11 accomplices were also given prison sentences. The reaction to this was stunned silence. Italian newspaper La Stampa reported, quote, "And with Filippo Maladia, this lesson will be listened to by many other Sicilians, who, like it or not, will have to know that something new is stirring in the countryside," unquote. As the courtroom emptied, reporters were able to briefly speak to the patriarchs of the Maladia and Viola families. Filippo Maladia's father, Vincenzo, indicated that he was not at all worried about his son's conviction. There was still time for a matrimonial rapportore. With such a marriage, the law allowed men's crimes to fall away even after the sentence had been handed down. Vincenzo seemed completely upbeat, suggesting that a wedding could be very quickly arranged. He stated, quote, "I really don't understand why Bernardo doesn't want this to happen. In his place, I would have married Franca and Filippo," unquote. In a complete contrast, Bernardo Viola remained steadfast that his daughter would never marry Filippo Maladia. The Viola family was simply keen to get on with their lives. When asked about Franca's future, Bernardo confirmed that she was studying to become a typist, and in the previous year she had received thousands of letters of support. She had gotten herself a driving license, and he supported her decision not to marry her violator. Bernardo was very confident that Franca would be just fine. Immediately after the trial, Filippo Maladia's legal team appealed his sentence, and on July 6 of 1967, they were slightly successful. The sentence was reduced from 11 years to 10 years in prison with 2 years of supervisory release. Part of the video which I released a week ago. Unfortunately, I'm not very good at editing and I lost a little bit of the footage and I couldn't include it in the last video. But I still have a part of the story which is left. So I just wanted to come on and give you the main juicy part of the story, actually, the happily ever after, which was left behind. As I said, I'm terrible at editing videos. So I'm going to tell you the second part of what happened in the life of Franca Viola. On the morning of Wednesday, December 4, 1968, as 20-year-old Franca Viola walked down slowly the aisle, on the other side of the aisle was 25-year-old accountant Giuseppe Luisi. Franca and Giuseppe had gone to school together and had lost touch in the intervening years. They were reacquainted at a family union in 1966, right before Franca was about to face Filippo Maladia in the court. Franca Viola was already dealing with severe public scrutiny about her decision to go to the court against Filippo Maladia, so she kept her courtship with Giuseppe a secret. He became her rock, and Franca wrote to him regularly and they wrote to each other, and that's how she was able to keep up her sanity in the middle of this maelstrom that she was facing. After the stress and attention of the entire court procedure faded, Giuseppe immediately proposed to Franca Viola. At first, Franca Viola refused his proposal. She feared that if Filippo Maladia would find out, then Giuseppe might be killed. However, Giuseppe was the kind of man who persisted. He told Franca that he would rather spend a short life as a husband than a whole life with any other woman. As soon as Franca accepted his proposal, Giuseppe, being really smart, applied for a marriage license as well as a gun license. Franca and Giuseppe opted to keep their wedding ceremony a very small and intimate affair. Only very close family members were invited, and the ceremony took place at the crack of dawn. A number of police officers who actually protected the Violas for a whole year were also invited to the wedding. In the lead up to the entire trial, Franca Viola's lawyer had become extremely close to the family, so he was also attending the wedding on that day. Franca and Giuseppe, in fact, received congratulations and wedding gifts from the Italian president, whose name was, by the way, also Giuseppe Saragat, and from the Italian Prime Minister Giovanni Leone. As the sun rose on their nuptials, the newlyweds made their way to Rome for a private audience with none other than the Pope. And that's how they celebrated the beginning of their new life. In the meantime, after serving 10 years for kidnapping and sexual assault of Franca Viola, Filippo Maladia was released from the prison. He was then immediately transported to the northern part of Italy, where he was confined to a small town known as Modena for the next 2 years to complete his supervised release. At no point in his entire life did Filippo Maladia show any remorse for the crime that he had committed. One day, which was on Wednesday, March 12th of 1978, after Filippo Maladia had finished his day's work, by this time he was working in an auto body shop as a mechanic, 38-year-old Filippo Maladia made his way to a nearby bar. As he stepped out of that bar after having lovely drinks for the entire evening, he was immediately executed. On Monday, December 19, 1966, less than 48 hours after Filippo Maladia had been found guilty and sentenced in the prison, 22-year-old Matea Travalovo was walking with her mom. That's when a Sicilian man by the name of Dennis Trade suddenly stopped his car alongside Matea. 3 men then walked out of this car, Matea's mom, and knocked her to the ground. Then these 3 men drove away with Matea. She was held captive and repeatedly sexually assaulted by a man by the name of Andrea Vitioso. After 4 days, the police eventually tracked down Matea at an empty cottage on the outskirts of town. Andrea Vitioso insisted that he had committed absolutely no crime. He was confident that Matea would agree to marry him just so that she could save face. But emboldened by the courage and resolve shown by Franca Viola, Matea denounced her rapist and she told the police that she would never agree to marry her assaulter. By doing this, Matea became the second woman who refused the matrimonial repertoire. A few days after that, 18-year-old Carmela Parisi was kidnapped in central Sicily and she too was sexually assaulted by a man by the name of Franco Matura. In this particular instance, Carmela's family did not stand with her. They wished for her to actually marry her violator. Carmela stood not only against her own family, she stood against all convention because she was also emboldened by the decision taken by Franca Viola. The floodgates in Sicily had truly opened. Girls and young women throughout Sicily were now breaking with tradition, a tradition that they had been punished with for centuries. Yet, it took another 15 years before the law, which rewarded sexual violence with marriage, was finally repealed in the year 1981. Franca and her father Bernardo's decision changed the course of Italian history and Italian law. In 2014, 66-year-old Franca Viola was awarded the Grand Officer of the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic by the then President Giorgio Napolitano. Franca received this award for her brief but extremely powerful contribution to the emancipation of women in Italy. So, this was the full story of Franca Viola. I do apologize that this part of the video had been lost, so I had to record myself yet again. So anyway, I really appreciate that some of you have already seen that video. Hopefully, after I add this one in, some of you will watch this video probably again or maybe for the first time. But do let me know what you thought of this particular story. I don't think in crime we usually get any feel-good stories. And though what happened to her was extremely uncalled for, but her bravery changed Italian law. So this is where I'll stop for today. And until I see you again, stay collectively vigilant.